Hi, I'm Sarwat Chadda. I'm a gamer, love role-playing games, love war games, do a little bit of miniature painting. I'm also a fantasy author. I write YA mid-grade. I've done work for IPs. I'm a husband, I'm a dad of a gamer and a modeler, so I feel that the genes have just about passed through the next generation. And I've been gaming since, gosh, I was like a little kid, since about when I was 11 or 12. And yeah, I still am. That hasn't changed. I remember this really clearly. A mate of mine said he got a game called Dungeons and Dragons, and I couldn't understand. You didn't play on a board. He explained that we just like come around, you make up your own characters, roll dice, and go on these crazy adventures. So it was first edition Dungeons and Dragons. There was typical school, nerdy school kids. We were playing Sundays from 2 till 7. I still have such fond memories of us gathering around the kitchen table at his or rotating around. But then as the Citadel minis became more and more part of the game, bit by bit I'd built up a large enough collection. So when the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles appeared, I had enough units, and also I bought Orion's Wood Elves, which I think was one of the first regiments of renown, and that's what got me started on building minis. So it was fantasy wargaming that I began, and I did that for a long, long time. So that was all through the 80s, and I think the pinnacle was third edition Warhammer Fantasy Battles. That's when and I still have my bulk of my Wood Elf army, but role-playing games has always been my first love. It was D&D fantasy stuff to begin with. Then in the early 1990s, Vampire the Masquerade just absolutely blew up. And throughout the 90s, that's what I played constantly, build a really massive campaign. And recently you've come back to it. So actually, yeah, first love, back into playing Gothic horror. And that's what we're running right now. Historical gaming came much, much later, and I think that's when I started really going to South London Warlords, because initially, when I joined the club, Warhammer 40,000 was still probably the most popular game, but over the last 10 years, it's been much more historical. And part of it is, I just love playing Saracens, so that was my excuse to build up my Saracen army. So I really love Dark Ages and the Crusades period. So the collections I have historically, and actually now saying that, Caesarian Romans. So the collections I have historically around those pockets. I'm not really into World War Two. Basically, as soon as firearms joined the battlefield, I'm not so interested. So for me, it's like swashbuckling, cavalry charges, all of that great stuff. Yeah, Saracens, Normans, Vikings, Romans, and Celts. Those are my core historical armies. I have a few samurai because a mate of mine's doing a test of honour, and you don't need a huge number of figures for that. But for me, the key thing is I'd never play unpainted. So sometimes the wargaming lags behind because I just haven't painted enough figures, and that's really probably one of the reasons I've not done World War Two, because I just don't have the patience to start a brand new army, and I find painting vehicles a bit tedious. So that's the other thing. So yeah, I think Saracens would be my favourite, but Romans and Celts are probably close second and third. The mad variety of it all. I think it's sometimes really fun to go beyond the boundaries of what's sensible, and fantasy gaming just allows you to do that. You can drop down a massive dragon into the middle of the battlefield. It's just great fun, and there's no baggage attached, and that's why I think is really excellent about fantasy wargaming. You can do the classic good versus evil themes because it's so clearly defined, you know, if you're doing Lord of the Rings, etc. And there's so many varieties within the fantasy genre itself. It's not just one monolith. It's not all just descended from Tolkien, although I admit that is the biggest, still remains the biggest influence. So I think sense of freedom to be able to play the classic good versus evil themes, and the chance to actually paint stuff that you wouldn't normally do. When I talk about not painting vehicles, I love painting monsters, and actually that's a chance for me to express my paint. And the miniatures are so gorgeous. The giants, the not just the dragons, but the hydras, the Pegasus cavalry. So they're really great, fresh opportunities from a painting point of view as well. And the minis produced nowadays are just unearthly detailed and gorgeous. They just look fantastic on the battlefield. For me, actually, what I really love is the power of the settings. So I'm not so much into the sandbox systems where the world isn't particularly defined and you're just allowed to play around and create yourself. For me, the ones that have had the most impact are the ones that are firmly established. They've got really deep histories already built into them, which ironically still gives you a huge amount of freedom. It seems contradictory, but because key archetypes or key locations or key characters already created, there's an interesting challenge in weaving stories through that, and perhaps that's what I find really intriguing. And I learnt how to do world building through role playing games, and those gave me the clues with which to create my own. So I still often return to those original worlds when I do the role playing, because part of it there's also nostalgia aspect. So, and I think that's the key reason for the success of Warhammer 40k. The narrative is so incredibly powerful. It sparks off ideas. Yeah, and I think so for me, the Conan Hyborian Age is probably my favourite because that's what I read as an early teen, so that's really implanted in me. But when I got into running my own role-playing campaign, Corgi brought out a small set of paperbacks that was called Dragon Warriors, and that was Dark Ages Britain. So they took a version of our Dark Ages medieval world askew with some great set Albion, equivalent of Arabia, and that was my favourite fantasy setting because there was enough in it that I was familiar with our world history, but there was enough of the mythic element to make it it was a low fantasy setting that suited me because the one thing that I always struggled with in Dungeons and Dragons was memorising all the spell lists. As a GM, you kind of really do need to know them. And so Dragon Warriors was a really, really brilliant system, really well written, really atmospheric. And over COVID, we returned to that setting and played like a 2.5 year campaign that I'd started back in the early 80s but never finished. So actually that was really brilliant. So there's a nostalgic element, but I think for me, I really like strong settings because that often inspires loads of new ideas and you can't really go wrong with that. And also there's that familiarity for the players too. They get the world because they know Conan, they know 40k, they know medieval Dark Ages Britain. So there's, you recognise a Norseman, you don't need to explain it all from scratch. So that works really well for me. Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Right, so with the Conan thing, it's my interpretation, right? So I'm running the Conan campaign. So, for example, the Conan campaign we've just finished was the classic boundaries of the Picts on the edge of civilization. It was the whole Aquilonia pushing the boundaries into Pictish wilderness. And in the Conan stories, typically the sympathies lay with the Aquilonians. They were the civilized folk. However, because this is my version, there's far more sympathy towards the Picts, who are having their lands encroached upon and quite rightly resent and want to defend them. So what's brilliant with the setting is you apply your prism, and the Picts are still just as barbaric, just as savage, just as sinister, but your sympathies can be with them too. Yeah, and one of the characters was a Pict. So you are looking at the world, but because it was so well detailed, R.E. Howard, he was just still a brilliant adventure writer. The stories are so vivid, the stories are so thrilling, but there are countless more stories you can take out of the setting that he created. And some of the characters were being played as heroes were female, right? But without needing to be the buxom, bosomy damsels in distresses, they hold their own. And so it's the modern storytelling prism that you are applying to R.E. Howard's world that can never be authentic because everything is a pastiche unless R.E. Howard wrote it. So I'd say mine is as valid a pastiche as anybody else's. I'm not writing Conan, I'm writing his world. What I love is a narrative. So with things like the Conan board game, what was brilliant was the narrative and the mechanics worked brilliantly together. It wasn't a game where they'd invented a set of mechanics and thought, right, can we just stick an IP onto it to sell it more? They developed a game that really felt like a Conan adventure. And that's what I think really, as well as it being my favourite character and my favourite setting, it felt like the perfect Conan game. The action's really intense, it's all really desperate, it all comes down literally to the last round and the last dice roll, and the Conan stories were traditionally short stories, and so there are a few campaigns available in the Conan board game, but most of them are just one-off adventures, which feels really appropriate and actually really does pick up the sense of being in a Conan story. And also because it's a board game, you can play Conan. Yeah, you can't really play Conan in a role-playing game because he just dominates it too much. While in a board game, yeah, everyone can play Conan today, somebody else plays Valeria, etc, etc. That's what I really love about the board games, whether they be Conan or whether they be, for example, Aliens, where you can play Ripley or you can play Hicks. You can play those iconic characters and they fit, for me, better in a board game one-off session than the idea that you're going to be playing these characters in some long-running role-playing game because they're just too dominant. And also the question then becomes whether you stick to canon or you go off canon. For example, we've recently run the Dune role-playing game, and I decided to set it almost 2 generations before Paul Atreides, because then there's not that worry of the overlap. Well, are we getting in the way of the main story? So you can have the purist in me still feels we're sticking to canon, but there's those other areas worth exploring where you can still have a couple of the key characters, like Thufir Hawat is still there because he served, from what I remember, 3 generations of Atreides. So early enough to have still some of the iconic characters, but not so intruding on when Dune kicks off. So that's what I really love about both board games and war games. I really love the narrative. So for me, my favourite fantasy, sci-fi war game remains 40k because the narrative is so compelling. And then also when I think about things like when I do historical, for me the sense of playing Saracens appeals to my Muslim heritage, yeah, and you have those iconic, Saladin versus Richard, you have those big stories in the back of your mind, even if you're not necessarily playing them out. So narrative for me really is what attracts me to any particular game. And I've just recently, literally a couple of days ago, played it was a card game, but it was 1066. and it was brilliantly detailed because all the characters you were playing were actually historical characters, and you felt the tension of building up to the Battle of Hastings. So narrative, whether it be a board game or a war game, it matters most to me. When the system perfectly matches the setting, then that's totally a double win. That's really, the perfect sweet spot. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes the system might be fairly generic and they've attached a particular historical period to it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And that's an interesting, different problem. There's a couple of games, the Aliens board game, which was Another Day in the Core, that's got a really great tension mechanic. The Alien role-playing game also has a real great tension stress mechanic. So they've really thought about, right, this is a type of narrative, so we need a system that supports that narrative. So with the Alien role-playing game, you really do feel everything's falling apart. Can you keep it together, or is it just going to be game over, man, game over? And that's brilliant. That's really brilliant. So actually that's a really brilliant question, because that might be why I avoid modern historical, because too often the narrative is something I don't feel comfortable with. I mean, World War Two aside, yeah. So more modern settings, like there's a few skirmish games that might be SEALs or the SAS versus like the Taliban or whatever it might be. I don't actually play those games, and part of it is because with the history and the background that I am familiar with, I don't like that somewhat simplified division of good versus the modern version of good versus evil. But what's interesting with something like historical, Crusades being a really valid point, a lot of fans of that period recognise the qualities of both sides, and it could be the distance that we actually think, oh, Saladin's a great hero, whatever side you're working, whatever side you're playing. So there's an interesting distance, there's an interesting appreciation that I pick up from those sorts of more ancient, older historical settings that are still lacking in the modern ones, and maybe it's a question of time. So if it's straight out of the news cycle today, I tend to avoid it because it just feels too sensitive. Whether it actually might be to do with the Middle East or Afghanistan or anywhere, I actually feel a bit more sensitive about that because the situation is evolving, because we actually picking up the news day by day. Sometimes it may feel inappropriate to be playing a game about things that are actually very current and terrible things are actually happening. Right now I'm running a Vampire the Masquerade game, which has only just started, but the most fun thing is we're setting in the local area, so West Nord, West Dulwich, and it is really great fun. This version, the 5th edition, is much more low key because in the earlier editions, I think it ended up basically being dark superheroes. Really want to avoid that. And so things like the vampire politics is certainly much further in the distance. It is really what it's like to have this constant hunger, this constant predatory feel, and how one would go about being a vampire in West Norwood. So we're having a lot of fun with that. We're playing roughly fortnightly, and again, I try not to plot too far in advance. So I have various threads, and I just basically write the ones the characters, the players pick, and then develop that week by week. Yeah, this is a bit of a throwback. So with Games Workshop going back into the old world, literally yesterday they put up on their website all the re what's the word, reproduction. Right. Basically they're bringing a lot of the wood elves from like the 90s back, and so I think, yeah, great, I'm going to start recollecting them. So I have my wood elf army, but there's a few gaps in it. I've decided I'm going to take my chance to fill those in. So it's not just that the old world system, but also they'll be perfectly adequate for Kings of War. So actually, it's not brand new, but I'm a little bit wary of starting something from utter scratch, because there's just so much painting I'm going to get done, and it's really prefer to build up on stuff that I've kind of already got rather than. But then again, they could announce something brand new. I think where I've got to get that. We've talked quite a lot about Conan, so I'm going to talk a bit more about it. I've just recently had the new Conan board game Kickstarter delivered, so at some point that will be appearing on the painting table. So it's yeah. I'm trying not to get too carried away with any new Kickstarters. So Wood Elves, Old World will be the next thing. They're brilliant. They're fundamental, and it keeps on going back to the narrative. The iconic heroes and villains, for me, help build a narrative. That if you look at 40k, the whole Horus heresy, the Phoenix Lords, because I collect the Eldar, so I really like those nexus points from which stories can sprout. And you don't even necessarily need to play them, they can just be there in the background. With things like Dune, for example, in the background of the short games we played, we've got a younger Duke Leto, we've got Vladimir Harkonnen, we've got Thufir Hawat, but they're all in the background. The players and the characters know that they're present. They know that they are pulling strings, but it adds a level of tension, and also adds a level of drama that wouldn't exist if they were just generic heroes or villains that have no history, or the history that I've just created. It's one of those things, especially for short games, become easy entry points for the players because they already know the setting, they already know who's involved, and yeah, like I said, it adds a level of drama. Oh, if we do this, it'll upset the Baron's plans, or Thufir sent us on a mission. So it adds a level of depth very, very easily, and that's always good when you're running, especially short games. And I found the perfect magic system in the Barbarians of Lemuria. And because I really struggle with knowing the intricacies of rule systems, times when I play Dungeons and Dragons, especially because there's so many spells, as a GM it's been difficult because there'll be a couple of players that know the spell systems really well. They'll able to outwit and anticipate me, because they'll say, oh, I have this perfect spell that totally counters what Sarwat's plans are. And then they're thinking the whole air has gone out of the balloon. But with Barbarians of Lemuria, and also it's anti-imaginative, because the spell list is so clearly defined, you're just basically applying a formula, which some people might argue is what magic may not be, based on the Jack Vance influences. But anyway, Barbarians of Lemuria had basically 4 levels. You had cantrips, you had level 1, which is a spell that a sorcerer can cast daily. Level 2, a spell that the sorcerer might be able to cast once in a year. And level 3, which is a spell a sorcerer will be able to cast once in a lifetime. So the way I equivalent, so a cantrip or level 1 might be, that door is locked, I blast it down. A level 2 could be, okay, that is a building, I'm going to cast a spell to make it collapse. Level 3 says, right, that's a city, I'm going to cast a spell that's an earthquake that'll destroy the city. And it was fantastic. There was nothing more to understand, and it really made the players much more imaginative about how they were going to create their own spells and the power of the spells. And what was brilliant was the players really understood how that felt as a level 3. That might be level 1, level 2. And there wasn't, because it was just 3 levels. just 3 levels, and so you could really easily block them out rather than if there were like 20 levels. Well, is that level 16? Was that level 17? What does it all mean? And I just absolutely loved it. Just a really nice way of breaking it down into really simple fundamentals, making the players bring their imagination to what it is to be a sorcerer, and them coming up with their own ideas. Oh right, I make a sacrifice or take this part from the monster because it might feed into this type of spell. Brilliant. Just absolutely loved it. Yes. It's actually, that's an interesting background how it all came about. So originally, when I was like 11, 12, a friend of ours was actually running the adventures. I was just a player. But at some point, the group changed and we were missing a GM. So I thought, okay, I'll take over GM duties. But I didn't want to buy the pre-written adventures because I thought, well, you only play them once. That's like £3.95 down the drain. I'd much rather spend those on minis. So I thought, actually, I'll just start writing my own. So that was literally the beginning of my writing career, was writing my own adventures, and Dragon Warriors was the campaign at that point because the rule systems were really nice and easy, and because the setting was really beautifully detailed, it really gave me a head start. So, yeah. However, what I've only done really recently, and it seems ridiculous it's taken me this long to do it, is I have an idea for a novel. So I thought I'm going to actually test out the plot as a mini campaign on the players. Yeah. And so I sort of knew the mystery, I knew the setting really roughly, but brought it to the role-playing group and says, okay, you're all being these characters, and it's not characters necessarily that can go in the story, but a wide range of characters, just see how it all developed. And what was fantastic was they came up with brilliant ideas I'd never have come up with that are now all going to feed into the novel. So what was funny was it's taken me this long to realise actually that's what I should do. Rather than have a campaign that I'm going to adapt to a novel, have a novel idea that I'm going to use as a campaign, see how it works. And what's brilliant is there's a magic system involved, and having the group's participation in developing that magic system was really refreshing and really exciting because they came up with loads of ideas that would never have crossed my mind. The pressure I feel is not to control the narrative, and that's actually something that's been really on my mind recently, where I don't want the players to feel they're being railroaded along a particular path, and the way to avoid that is not to plot too much. So I try only to plot the next adventure. Yeah, there will be threads and clues that may or may not be relevant, but really trying to make sure that I'm away enough from the story that they're making 100% of all the decisions, that I'm not making suggestions because I think that would be a better idea. So I think from having the job as a writer, that's not your job as a GM. It's the player's job to create the story. You're just there to provide the framework for it. So that's something that I'm really aware of. And so far so good, but I think the way to do it is by not having an elaborate 5-year campaign plotted out in advance, because then you'll think, right, the characters have to make all of these decisions to get to the end. No, the way around is actually, no, I'm not planning anything beyond this week's session. Probably about 10 years ago, I wrote my first proper high fantasy trilogy, Shadow Magic. It was written under a pen name, Joshua Khan, because I had other books coming out with other publishers as Sarwat, so I thought actually we'll do these separately. But it was a proper mid-grade fancy, quite inspired by Game of Thrones, the idea of the different houses, but these different houses all control different type of magic. So House Shadow, the necromancers, House Solar, the Lords of Light. Then you had House of Created Fire, controlled fire. So the magic system was fun to develop because it had to be based on an element, and that was the only magic that they had. But then there's plenty of opportunity to explore the edges, the fringes of that elemental control. So really, really had great fun writing it. It was a really fun trilogy. I did maps for the books. I'd done vast amounts of histories on them that I gave away as appendices in newsletters, etc., etc. So really, really wholehearted world building. And I thought actually it'd be really great fun to then develop a role-playing game out of it. But at that point I realised I'm really rubbish at creating rules. And so I gave it a bit of a go. I think it lasted as far as the introduction. And I thought, no, this really doesn't suit me. And it's one of those things that, but also there's so many brilliant games out there already. They think, oh, it wouldn't be difficult to just adapt it, but part of it is just time. And I'm not really a games designer, so that sort of writing doesn't really appeal to me. I'm not very good at explaining stuff, but maybe at some point. But that was my one attempt, and it really did make me realise actually I'm just not a games designer. She's been incredibly supportive of my career from the very beginning because she knew that I really wasn't happy as an engineer, and I was spending a lot of time doing gaming stuff, right, writing adventures and things, and so it felt like a natural opportunity. But at that point I didn't know how good I was at actually writing novels. The thing that probably bothers her more now than anything is the storage, because that's the thing about gaming. You just buy so much stuff, right? And the loft is absolutely heaving under the armies and boxes, and some, I will admit, haven't even been taken out of the shrink wrap. It's the whole shiny box syndrome. So I think the shiny box syndrome is probably the biggest issue. From my wife's point of view, I think there's the risk of me living too isolated a lifestyle, and actually times to stop and go out and about and not think about work and not actually think about gaming too. I mean, the gaming kind of still feels a little bit as a hobby rather than a massive preoccupation. But it's quite clear how the gaming fed into my writing and still does. And also gaming is incredibly social. So interestingly, the gaming does balance out the isolated aspect of being a writer where you're just basically in your room by yourself for days upon end. So the gaming is a perfect, I mean, we just played on Monday, catch up with, your 6, 7 mates, round the table, have a chit chat, roll some dice. Perfect balance. No, she didn't. Because we met in Hong Kong. And at that point I had no gaming stuff because it was all back here. We did run a few little role-playing gatherings with friends with really informal rules. It wasn't any particularly elaborate. And I think even when we came back, I don't think I really got back into gaming until probably about 13, 14 years ago, which seems like a long time, but I mean, we've been married for almost 30, so I think, everything was a little bit under control for a while. I think it's down to Kickstarters because there's so much amazing stuff out there in so many genres. Something will come along and says, oh wow, that's the thing I really love, and look, there's a game for it, there's minis for it, and there's expansions for it. I've mentioned Conan plenty of times, but then like Aliens, that's another setting that I really love, and there's been so many games based on that license that you kind of feel obliged to buy them all. I'm trying better to get rid of stuff, so over the last couple of years, I've been running a few mini campaigns with the whole idea I'm going to run this campaign, I'm going to play a nice little arc, and then I'm going to sell it. So that happened with Star Wars, a Star Wars role-playing game. We played a nice little arc. Um, all ended very dramatically, and think that's that. I'm now just going to move it on to the, bring it by. Likewise with Star Trek, played a nice little mini campaign. Think right, just so I'm trying a little bit more to move stuff along, but part of the problem is I know that obviously if I wanted to run another Star Wars adventure, it's quite easy just to buy the latest edition and you're back where you started. Uh, trying to be a little bit more dedicated to just playing the stuff that I already have. But as I said previously, the Wood Elves are back in the Warhammer world. I need to buy all those box sets. So this is going back probably about, I mean, they're in their 20s now. So when they were probably about not even 10, we passed a charity shop and it had like the first edition box set of Talisman for £1. And I said, oh my gosh, I really remember playing this when I was a kid. Bought it immediately, set it out on the carpet and they played and absolutely loved it. And then so we went through this whole period of, when they were in 10, 11, 12, those sorts of ages, searching out on eBay for the different expansions, whether they might be tatty boxes or whatever. So got Talisman Dungeon, there was Talisman Adventure, Talisman Timescape. So collected all of them. And what's brilliant is and then probably about when they were in their early mid-teens, they had to go doing their own board because they were really into the Pirates of the Caribbean. So they did their ocean board with mermaids and islands, and it was, you know what, I think they were actually a bit older than that. It was the first lockdown. That was their lockdown project, was to paint up the board, etc. And even now, every now and then, they'll still get Talisman out, just lay out all the different boards, kind of make up their own rules. It's funny how there's a tendency with the elder, she really loves playing the dwarf. For some reason, she's really got the dwarf tactics down seamlessly. So Talisman, interestingly, is still like a party game. But the eldest, when she went to uni, really got involved in the role-playing society and board games. So she's got Twilight Imperium upstairs in the bedroom. So yeah, she's gone proper hardcore gamer. While the youngest, interesting enough, really loves model making. And so she's not into the gaming element at all, but she's, for my birthday, and I'll send you a photo later, she made me Bilbo's Hobbit hole. Yeah. And what's fantastic is she made it all from scratch, no kit, yeah. All eyeballed it, even the light inside works properly. And so she's really, but oh my god, she used so much of my flock in covering it all. So she's really got into model making, and she's also made, when she went to uni, she made a small model of her room with like all the little posters printed in microscopic detail, and you can tell that's her room. So she's really got into model making. It's not, what's brilliant, it's not kit, it's proper old school, bits of cardboard, bits of like matchsticks, or like, the coffee stirrers, and modelling clay, all made totally from scratch. So yeah, that's what she's really gone to, which is fascinating because I was never into that, but that's her jam. What friendships don't come out of a common shared interest? Yeah. So I don't know what to compare it against, because it's not that I'm like a football fan, so I follow a particular club, etc., etc. My hobby's always been gaming, so it seemed natural. And the fact is, I only live down the road from South London Warlords, so it seemed inevitable that my friendship groups would be around gaming and would be other gamers. What's been interesting is how that's evolved now that the kids have grown up, because previously a lot of restrictions on the fact that the kids were little, etc., etc. And so gaming was always limited to things like bedtime routines. Can't really spend that amount of time gaming because one's got to be at home looking after the kids. So gaming's now become even more so now my girls have grown up and my friends' kids have also grown up. There's a few still with younger kids. So, and also maybe the people that are into gaming, and I'm talking more about perhaps fancy role playing necessarily than wargaming, are my type of people that it's actually, now that you mention it, it's an interesting. I don't have very many friends that play World War Two historical type, yeah, and is that because I'm not interested, but then likewise they're not particularly interested in it either. But they, for example, one of my best mates, he plays American Civil War, which I have absolutely no interest in. But I think my core friendship groups are probably out of my role playing gang. And it could be because they're the people I'm seeing on a really regular basis. And also, there's probably a filtering system. You invite people along, they either do or do not get into it. They're the ones you end up seeing more, or you discover you have other shared interests. And so it just grows out of that. And because I probably don't have that many hobbies outside of gaming, I don't overlap with other cliques. So it's if like I said, if I follow football, I might have a clique of footballing mates, but I don't really. So I don't. It's reading. Yeah. If you get into gaming, you will become a reader if you weren't already. And it could be as much. It could be like you're into, past Games Workshop. You really like the minis. You started 40k. Now you want to start reading the lore. Yeah, you want the codexes. You think, all right, those novels. It's got like Sanguinius. He's my favourite Primarch. I want to read all of that. And so it's something that I found quite interesting with regards to my youngest, because my youngest wasn't that keen a reader, so we really struggled for ages to find the genre or the type of book she might get into that would then make her become a reader. And she's really, even now she's mad on tigers, so we just bought her books on tigers. So totally not interested in them, yeah, because she recognised that they were a chore rather than a delight she discovered. So we sort of actually left her to it. She got into graphic novels, absolutely collected loads of them, but they weren't fancy graphic novels. They were just basically day to day girl with her friends at school, etc., etc. Read all of those, and then from that, just everything took off, and then she went and did a degree in philosophy, which had been like, just all goes flying over my head. So literacy, whichever is, I think, inevitable out of gaming, because if you're a gamer, you have to read, and it's part, and going back to my first point about, for me, the thing that most appealed most is the narrative. So there's so much of the expanded universe beyond the actual game itself. Dark Library, for example, Black Library, Black Library being a perfect example. There's so much you could be reading about outside of the game that still feels the game. But the other thing, and I actually think it's becoming more and more important, and it's a slightly double-edged sword, is now that COVID's ended, there's the social community aspect of meeting around the dining table, playing a game week on, week out with your friends. But the flip side to that is what I'm aware of, or becoming aware of, is the toxic phantom element online, where there are cliques that, because of the echo chamber element of the internet, become more extreme, or go down, forget it's just a game, forget that people are here just to have fun. No one is a doorkeeper on any of this. That sort of, for me, goes against the very principles of what fantasy sci-fi should be. The fact is, it should be about exploration of whichever direction you want to go. The game you are playing is your game. Nobody should dictate to you you're not playing it correctly. It's not, none of their business. Yeah. So going back to the Conan thing, there is no rule set on saying Conan should be played this way. It's for me and the group to interpret how we want to play it, yeah? And if everyone's having fun, that's all that actually matters. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. And I think and I brought this up on a slightly different thing, when I was a kid collecting comics, there wasn't really a division between being a Marvel fan and a DC fan. you just liked reading comics. So you'd read Batman, you'd read Daredevil, you'd read X-Men, you'd read Justice League. And maybe that still is the majority. Maybe the problem with the internet is it's the clickbait element. It's the more extreme versions that get more the clicks and therefore come the first things that pop up. So that's a thing that I would be wary of, because it just spoils it, really does. And to what purpose? You're really there to have fun, and it's your game. As soon as you set it out on the table, it is your game, nobody else's. I think it just feels more naturally better, yeah. And also, I think with being online, especially if you're like, typing, yeah, you can't explain yourself fully. Everything is like snippets, little sound bites. It's not the whole discussion. While actually around the table, and also the whole thing about visual interaction, the clues of the way the person looks is engaged, and also there's a proper community sense. Everyone's here to have fun, yeah. While the thing about being online is how it can be distraction. And I'm as guilty as anyone. My job is to just sit there typing away. It's far too easy, just vanish down rabbit holes, yeah. And for example, I'm no longer on Twitter/X, and bit by bit, I'm trying to rid myself of as much social media as possible, sticking to basically painting demos on YouTube. But I'm of a different generation, while my daughters already have pretty good boundaries with regard to social media. And so what's really interesting is they're less engaged in social media than I am. Part of it could be because my job kind of requires me to be on social media. You need to be spreading the word about books, etc., while they don't. Yeah, so their social media circle is actually very, very small. It's just basically really their immediate mates. There's not that much else that they use it for. So maybe the younger generation are already imposing their boundaries, and we don't really have to worry about it. Maybe it's us, because we kind of floundering, are caught up in stuff that isn't really that relevant. And so just getting better at recognising clickbait. I think that's really been my key achievement on social media. Think, that's clickbait. They just want me to waste my time getting caught up in a circular argument. No, thank you. All right, I think those days are long gone. I think the social media, internet, is the new location of the fear. The whole thing about incels, yeah, you could argue that the nerdy archetype of a gamer implies an incel. The cliche of the gamer is somebody that's down in their basement with their, on the computer way too much, etc. So I think fears have always existed with regard to the younger generation, because I'm a big comic fan. So the whole thing about the 1950s, when the Comic Code Authority became established, the idea that reading comics led to delinquency. And then do you remember in the 80s the whole thing about video nasties? Yeah. So I think there's always been a fear that the younger generation are on the edge of basically bringing the collapse of society upon them. And I think the Satanic Panic was that for the beginning of the role-playing games. I think the fear over the internet, incel, and sort of Andrew Tate fans is now that for this generation. And part of it, as we're just talking about, our kids have already started establishing their own healthy boundaries. And so there's a certain element, there's always going to be a fringe group or personalities that do get caught up in this. And in the 70s, football hooliganism. So there's always been some fear that we're on the verge of societal collapse because the kids have all gone off the rails. And I think that's actually a little bit arrogant to assume that our children won't find their own way in the same way that we didn't. I don't know about you, but devil worship is not part of my life, even though I did grow up throughout the whole 80s playing Dungeons and Dragons. So, I think there's a certain element of being aware of what's going on, but then just not getting caught up in the witch hunting frenzy of it all. Right, there's two here. First is find the genre or setting you're really into, because I guarantee there'll be a game out there that offers that. But the other is the rule system element, because I think what I've noticed is games are now being written for gamers. They're already assuming a certain element of pre-knowledge already. And I've picked up, for example, the new Player's Handbook, and I was looking at it thinking, well, if I was starting from scratch, I'd find this really hard work. And there needs to be a little bit of a step back. There are starter boxes that are great. So I think perhaps that's how I'd recommend it. Find the starter box. First of all, it's a very low entry point cost. Yeah, it's like 20 quid typically. If it's done properly, the rule system should be easy to explain. Recently I bought like the Dune role-playing game starter box, and it's meant to be read straight out of the box. So they introduce rules chapter by chapter. That could be the best way forward. Starbox in a genre setting that you love, take it from there really. I mean, yeah. Also, especially, games are also pretty expensive, so you don't want to be spending loads of money on a game. You think, I really hated it, or I didn't really get into it, and I'm just going to be, that's it. So, yeah, and it's like when we started, it was like Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. That was literally the only things really out there, and that was more than enough.